My name is Benjamin Nymark, Queen Mary, University of London. Here's my email address. The title of my talk, Snapshot of Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Wider Environmental Effects from the Israel-Gaza Conflict. I hope later on I don't sort of bombard us with sort of numbers and facts and a rollout of all the kind of statistics of the conflict. I felt sort of a bit compelled to bring them in, particularly when we're talking about the wider environmental effects. But hopefully, it'll provide some context to ways in which we could think about these things in a linked fashion rather than sort of individual. And I'll get to that in a second, what I mean by that. Um, I just recently gave a talk to the National Health Service, the NHS in the UK, sort of Bart's Health Trust. Now I'm realizing I'm putting this sort of picture up there with the NHS. I don't mean to, although it does seem like the NHS is sort of on fire. But the point of me mentioning this is the Barts Health Trust is one of the largest sort of hospital consortium of hospitals located in London where I work. And the group was very interested, like many of you, who are a group of, or some of them are physicians and health workers that see the climate crisis, militarization, and its links to acute threats to global health. By many measures, it's progressive to link climate change, health, and war. It is, in my experience, not necessarily the first link that many make. In fact, by some measures, it's the last link that most people think about. But now the important links between health and environment have been obvious for some time, especially for those here, of course. Um, so studies on the toxicity of kind of thinking about these links have mainly focused on the toxicity of post-industrial and decommissioned military sites, historically, by which many of you have been quite active in, I'm sure, as well as active military, mainly in the UK, particularly in the environmental justice movement, as well as active military, mainly in the UK and the US, and have brought kind of a field of study of health geographers and other researchers seeking to understand the sort of long and short term environmental effects of militarization. Much of this work, most recently by a colleague of mine, Kali Rubari, has involved looking at sort of military burn pits in Iraq and toxins left over from munitions or in Syria and also Iraq. Kali is at Purdue University and is part of a paper that we've been writing together, and I'll talk about in a second. But new work, kind of thinking about climate change, global warming, and the kind of reactivating some of this radioactive material, such as in the Marshall Islands, right? And some of you might be familiar with some of this work, but just a sort of taste of some of the work that we sort of know about. Um, However, linking climate change and war, and sort of in particular carbon emissions as a field of study, has of course begun to pick up momentum, and something we were discussing, right before this meeting. Here are a few by my network directly, which I could, of course, share later. The whole host of people, scientists of global responsibility, conflict and environment observatory, Newcastle University, Durham University, some of these in the UK. And so what I'm going to do for you today is provide a brief overview of some of my work in this space and a snapshot of a recent study we did on Israel-Gaza, going to kind of key in a particular part of this study and kind of part of many of these studies, which are somewhat sort of there, but under the layer, right? When we think about war and environmental effects, we more think about sort of tanks and bombs and soldiers but we explored actually infrastructure as a weapon of war to measure carbon and came out with some interesting results, which we do bring forward to our Israel Gaza study. Maybe a bit overshadowed by the death of the World KitchenAid workers last week, but the Israeli withdrawal 2 weeks ago from Al Shifra, I think, is sort of what is a kind of uh, a turning point, and if not an inflection point in the war. And I'll come back to this and how infrastructure in particular, Al Shifa Hospital kind of sees it is somewhat of a symbol of what we see as a kind of a, a space by which is worthy of investigation um, when thinking about climate effects of war. Al Shifa was one of the largest and most important medical complexes and central hospital in the Gaza Strip. Located in Gaza City, it has become a symbol or if anything, a lightning rod of this conflict. I'm not going to rehearse the sort of political diversive arguments around Al Shifa, or as much as say that the health conflict was, if anything, a central symbol of what's going on, both being seen as a civilian institution or military stronghold, a terrorist hive, an embodiment of Israel's perceived regard for civilian life and infrastructure in pursuit of Hamas, and what many of the Palestinian sides see as a genocide of the Gazans, right? It is, if anything, a symbol, I argue, for now the thousands of lives caught up in the deadly crossfire and daily suffering that will now have to be endured without adequate health facility for years to come. The conflict is particularly acute for health professionals, as you know. The numbers fluctuate, but clearly hundreds have been killed. Historically, health professionals have been on the front lines of every conflict, targeted like everyone else, but the centrality of hospitals, both as targets and purported military stations, refugee safe havens, have clearly made this conflict like no other. I'm not necessarily telling you anything you don't already know, right? All this just to set up what I believe is an important yet under-researched and under-discussed aspect of the conflict and the climate crisis overall, the carbon footprint of war. We all know that war is bad for the environment, right? With toxic chemicals left polluting the soil and water for decades after the fighting ceases. As infrastructure is damaged, raw sewage seeps out into the streets, oceans, and natural water sources. Food stocks run low, farms and fisheries do not operate. Increase of diesel generators, startup, wood stocks, including plastics, paper, and basically anything that can burn, turns into fuel and heat to cook. When hospital is destroyed, all these effects become amplified because there is no central health facility to turn to. These environmental health effects are obvious, but I believe much less obvious are the carbon emissions from these conflicts and their long-term impacts on the climate. You know, now one might say, and you might be thinking, and we kind of get this question a lot, why measure carbon in a time when over 30,000 have been killed and over 75,000 have been injured, depending on, and 100 still remain hostage? My answer is twofold. First, we cannot, as a species, hold, like, I question whether or not, as a species, we can hold on to two crises and respond with adequate responses to both simultaneously. And second, I, for one, do not see these as separate, but hopefully, as we could discuss later on, as interlinked crises. Now, before I get ahead of myself, I think it's important to take a step back for a moment and to provide some background on military missions and climate work, which sort of led us to this point. So my work here today is sort of based on and was funded up to January on a 2-year project by the UKRI. This is the main funding source, the Environmental Social Research Council in the UK. I was originally at Lancaster University working there with colleagues at Durham, and then have moved recently to Queen Mary University at London. And the point of this project for the past 7 years or so, we've been working alongside a group of civil society activists to bring attention to the militaries as global climate actors, particularly their role in contributing to the global climate crisis. A project that the project here was in a sense an attempt to break down what we saw and what many people see as a sort of massive, the massive task of calculating carbon emissions from the US military or any such militaries. And what we do so by calculating one sliver of one of the largest logistical supply chains in the world, which we figured could provide a baseline understanding on how war material flows and what its carbon footprint is. We figured if militaries themselves are not going to account for their own carbon footprint, then independent research must take place that does so. we measured, amongst other things, the use of concrete as a weapon of war. Concrete, as we know, is the fourth largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally, mainly in its roasting, or what they call the chemical sort of change of clinkification to burn limestone and turn it into cement. And the U.S. military uses a lot of concrete. By examining one sliver of these kind of hidden carbon emissions of late modern warfare, we focus on the use of concrete and its use in blast walls by the U.S. forces in Baghdad over a 5-year period. We do this as sort of setting a kind of particular methodology by which others could then use to do their own carbon calculations. During the occupation of Baghdad, the U.S. military laid miles of blast walls by means of population control, urban counterinsurgency. Blast walls were used to mitigate against damage caused by IEDs, implanted by insurgents, to manage civilian populations, insurgent movements. Concrete is one of the oldest and extensively procured materials by the U.S. military. Among it, it's often underrepresented as a weapon in itself. Our work has shown that the utilization of concrete infrastructure by militaries constitute a significant tactic to mitigate the effects of insurgent axis, spread security in places not just Iraq, but Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, and Syria. Indeed, the instrumentation of concrete, particularly blast walls, reflects the urbanization of warfare in the late 21st century. And here's an example of the sort of walls that were put up alongside and around Baghdad and Afghanistan, these T walls or blast walls. What we did was measure, and I'm going to just going through this quite quickly to show you sort of like some of the methodology or some of the thinking and conceptual analysis of what kind of set us on this path to then do the work in Israel, Gaza. Our analysis of Baghdad, the blast walls put up in Baghdad, based on available maps, shows the extent of concrete walls, which we measured to be 412 kilometers, a tad bit more than the distance from London to Paris. And we measured based on sort of one segment of these walls and then counting up all the segments that would have needed to be set up to fill this distance was roughly 200,000 tons of carbon CO2 equivalent, which is roughly the equivalent of the total automobile tailpipe emissions of the United Kingdom. In other words, colleagues and I measured the hydrocarbon consumption over a 10-year clip found in 2017, a sort of representative year, estimated that the U.S. military alone contributes to more greenhouse gases emissions than over 150 countries, equal to that of Portugal. Too often, discussions on the links between militaries and climate change focus only on the future risks to global security in climate-affected settings. There are sort of many tepid attempts by militaries to green their war machines, developing electric tanks or Navy ships run on biofuels. A paper I put together with a co-author on the U.S. Great Green Fleet, which was a sort of tepid attempt to create a frigate on drop-in biofuels. Yet there's very little discussion on how they contribute themselves to climate change, especially during war. Militaries, as we might already know, are not very transparent. Extremely difficult to access the data needed to run comprehensive carbon emission calculations, even in peacetime. Researchers, such as ourselves, are essentially left on their own, right? We need to use an array of methods colleagues and I have found to sort of open up this black box of wartime emissions and demand transparent reporting of military emissions to the UN climate body, the UNFCCC. We've therefore developed a sort of hybrid methodology, allowing for researchers to use what is the kind of tool of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions analysis, life cycle analysis, LCA, and sort of think about it, in particularly in our recent paper, as a tool of resistance, sort of a way of resisting militaries' attempts to sort of hide their carbon emissions. Taking into account full supply chains and measuring of their environmental climate impact, we're hoping for activists and others to actually run their own greenhouse gas emissions and call out militaries as global climate actors. Right. And this is a sort of paper that's also sort of in peer review, parting the fog of war, accessing military greenhouse gas emissions from below. And this is sort of one of the aspects of what we tried to do, and what we did also in the Israel Gaza paper, to sort of think about the methodology of not just the sort of one aspect, one sliver of material that militaries use, but starting all the way from where those materials are being extracted from to all the way to the end of life, with sort of real cradle to grave, and being able to kind of measure both the environmental and carbon effects of the full supply chain. Um, this is what we brought to this study, and this is the title and the preprint of our study, which we're now, as I mentioned, uh, turning into a full peer-reviewed paper, going to be submitted quite soon with colleagues. Um, the decades-old conflict in Israel-Palestine has reached an inflection point. Israel's ground invasion in Gaza, um, following the horrific attacks by Hamas in October 7th, 2023, shows no signs of letting up. And after months of unprecedented bombardment, the human costs of the conflict are reaching scales previously unforeseen in the region. The numbers, of course, are staggering. Over 30,000 in Palestine, 1,139 in Israel have died, and over 100 Israelis and foreign nationals still being held by Hamas. Estimates place around 35 to 45, if not higher now, of Gaza buildings, homes, schools, mosques, hospitals as destroyed and damaged. According to the Bank of Israel, initial forecasts of the financial cost to Israel is expected to reach up to about 50 billion, including rebuilding Gaza. And so what we did was we took a step back, knowing the methodology and the work that we've done in the past, and we've kind of adopted what is a really, really important and I think ingenious intervention here by a colleague of ours at the Conflict Environment Observatory, Lindsay Kotel, who is thinking about this in a way, and that now has joined the paper and is working with this on a kind of scope 3 wartime emissions. Now, we're going to take a step back and sort of explain to you, I'm sure many of you know, when you're measuring greenhouse gas emissions, you do it in a particular, or you choose a particular scope by in which the amount of data you have and sort of boundaries that you set. And so scope 1 is more generally, and I'll turn to this in a second, scope 1 is more generally sort of greenhouse gas emissions or direct sort of tailpipe emissions, right? If you think about a car and you measure the amount of greenhouse gases or carbon coming out of that car's tailpipe, right? And that would be a scope 1 sort of measurement. The scope 2 measurement would be sort of all the fossil fuels that sort of make their way and the energy it takes to sort of get that car running, plus the tailpipe emissions. Scope 3 emissions, so if you want to move the scopes larger, you want to think about scope 3 emissions as being kind of the way in which emissions might be measured through the full supply chain, as I mentioned to you before, a kind of cradle to grave approach. And colleagues have noticed through Parkinson and Lindsay Kotel that if you start to kind of think about supply chain emissions, you could take your scope 1 emissions and multiply it by at least 4 to 7.7 times more if you start to really think about it in the larger scope 3 emissions. What we're arguing now in this paper, and that the scope 3 plus or wartime fighting emissions are so distinct and unique in a sense that they need to actually be provided their own scope, right? And so knowing that, more generally, we have some data of fuel use and energy use, scope 1 and scope 2, and somewhat limited data in scope 3 emissions. The scope 3 plus emissions really, really help kind of provide a more comprehensive understanding. And I want to thank the Conflict Environment Observatory and other partners that we work with in the Military Emissions Gap project, which I'll show a slide later, for these slides with permission. So what we did was we actually over my holiday, as I mentioned to Tim and Laura before, right? And so this was sort of my holiday, right? Thinking about Christmas and New Year's, thinking about coming out of COP28 in UEA, AE, in and thinking about how militaries were just absent from the conversation at the climate meetings, and that there it demanded a response. And I think this was, in a sense, a way to sort of bring it to the fore that war itself, which was what everyone was sort of speaking about at the climate conference, was really absent in terms of its links to carbon emissions. And so we took a step back and thought about, well, what were the really big sort of important pieces of this war that we thought were causing the largest emissions. And of course, we went to the traditional kind of measurements of tanks and fuel use in those tanks, munitions and bombardment of those munitions, the manufacturing of those munitions. Um, but we also sort of started to think about, knowing that the expertise that we had, the use of concrete and sort of, what were the kind of both in defense and offensive uses of concrete in the war. And we sort of brought it into a kind of the original study did a 60-day snapshot of the war, flights and tanks and other things. And then we moved it to thinking about what does the Hamas's tunnels as a kind of weapon of war, what would be the carbon emissions of the development of that, right? Knowing the massive amount of concrete that was used to develop those. Or on the Israeli side, something called the Smart Wall, which was a kind of fortification again around that surrounded Gaza, and the amount of iron and concrete, as you see in the back in this picture, used in this. And so we measured those as well as sort of intermediate um, greenhouse gas emissions. And what we saw was that, you know, the projected emissions from the first 60 days of the Israel-Gaza conflict were greater than the annual emissions of 20 individual countries and territories. If we included sort of war infrastructure built by both Israel and Hamas, including the Hamas tunnel network and Israel's kind of protective iron wall or smart wall, the total emissions increased to more than 33 individual countries and territories. Um, if we then moved outward a bit into our kind of more sort of long term, and this is where the real carbon emissions start to tail up. The carbon costs of reconstructing Gaza are, as you can imagine, enormous. Rebuilding Gaza will entail the total annual emissions figure higher than over 130 countries, sort of putting them on par with a kind of medium-sized country to that of New Zealand. Again, and I think it's important to sort of bring this back to sort of the ad hoc nature of these calculations, point to the sort of what we see as the urgent need for mandatory military emissions reporting for both war and peacetime through the UN FCCC. And so, again, this is a sort of snapshot analysis, and we also wanted to note that sometimes it's helpful to kind of put this into context that the Israel-Gaza war, from just the first sort of 60 days of the conflict, puts it in somewhere within the kind of frame of a small country. Yeah. So sort of moving on from there, I think it's important to sort of also think about, and I was asked to kind of talk about the wider environmental effects of the conflict. And again, I don't want to bog us down, and I'd rather kind of move through this somewhat freely and quickly. Um, on the numbers and to be thinking about this and in a way in which I think it's really important to kind of as a take home message that um, these things are not separate, right? They are intertwined, and we can talk about how they're intertwined and the ways in which they're intertwined. Um, that environmental health, war, and greenhouse gas emissions all are in relation and have a real strong connection to them. A colleague of mine, Patrick Bigger, and colleagues at the US think tank, the Climate and Community Project, have noted that there are two crucial phenomena that affected climate vulnerability in Palestine, right? The broken or undermined infrastructure has limited or outright eliminated sort of Palestinian access to crucial rights and services. um, if we want to harken back to the Al Shifa Hospital, right, and sort of like what does this now mean for those for future healthcare, for a functioning society, to have the sort of central hospital in a place like Gaza now utterly useless. When we think about land and the way in which land has been constrained and spatial movements has decreased, farmers can't farm, fishers can't fish, food access is now even more sort of dependent on outside sources. Um, the economy is in shambles. Agricultural production is absolutely non-existent, and the links that the long-term effects of critical biodiversity are, if anything, not going to be measured for some time to come. Already the Middle East Mediterranean had already been observed as a kind of hotspot, right? An intensification, hydrologically, ecologically, and agriculturally, a sort of intensification of droughts. Sorry. The projections include that there's going to be further sort of aridity, less precipitation. This, of course, encourages wildfires. And of course, there's going to be an effect of like an increase in salinity of existing aquifers. Palestinians, and again, I'm stating the obvious, but good to keep within context, particularly as we move towards the discussion here, being much more vulnerable to the effects of these climate effects, and particularly now in a inhabitable sort of war zone, right? Gazans' access to water includes, from all sources, desalination, and external sources dropped by 95%. Without any energy, all 5 wastewater treatment plants and its sewage pumping stations are forced to shut down. 70% of Gazans now resort to drinking salty and contaminated water. An estimation of a significant number of their sort of sanitation and facilities, all public services have dropped down, all affecting the way in which water now can be accessed and used. And this sort of gets back to what I think is a sort of double effect of right, Al Shifa and the hospital, right? When we start thinking about the debris, right? We look at these pictures, and these pictures seem to be repeating themselves when we think about areas of Baghdad during the bombardment, or Afghanistan and Kabul, or of course Syria comes to mind, and just the sort of tons and tons of debris and rubble that will take years to remove. This rubble is not just a sort of kind of a domicide, right? A loss of space and to live. It adds to a sort of toxic mist of dust, ash, and other materials, substances, glass, wood, lead, asbestos, right? PCBs, carcinogens, all these things that make these buildings sort of being built, and their inability now, not just to live in, but become sort of a toxic sort of sludge, right? And causing a whole host of hidden health problems. Um, the damage to critical infrastructure, right? We could go through this. Um, all this necessarily just to say that there's going to be a whole sort of amount of conversation, I think, starting to has already started been brewing, but I think more and more moving forward about the cost of rebuilding Gaza. And we have to keep in mind that a rebuilt Gaza in the way in which it was originally built is not necessarily sustainable, right? It's going to be have itself a huge carbon footprint, and is also needs to be thought about in terms of potentially what might be a kind of a whole a reigniting of this war. If history has taught us anything, this space has not necessarily been a bastion of peace. And so, what does that look like, and what costs beyond just sort of price costs are going to go into this? Um, Again, I know I'm sort of bombarding you with all this. I promised you I wasn't, but it's a lot to think about, and I think it's important for us to sort of look at the totality of all this. But roughly around 20 to 30% of agricultural land now is disrupted. A whole huge amount of Gaza's fishing fleet is now disrupted. A significant amount of research is going in on this amount to livelihoods, right? And so, what do people return to? How do they rebuild? How do they you know, have any types of self-sustaining livelihoods? So this just leads me to, I think, what might be sort of one of my last slides, and I could put this back up if we want to think about it. But um, where does future climate look like of Gaza? Right, rising temperatures will clearly affect the young and the old. Most of the solar electricity generation, air conditioning, the other fundamental needs for survival as the heat sort of turns up. Houses are built. There's really no place to return to. And having said that, sea level rise will definitely encroach on seawater in depleted the coastal aquifer, so the main source of water. Um, and so again, I sort of think about it, and I want to think about this in a critical way, to as conversations start to sort of bubble up about what does rebuilding Gaza look like. It almost it is incumbent on us to be thinking about it in a much more climate friendly way. Um, the last slide I kind of wanted to sort of put here is a really important one. This is a project that uh, the Concrete Impacts Project and the Conflict and Environment Observatory, a civil society group based in the UK but works globally, does really, really important work. We've joined together and we created the Military Emissions Gap. And if many of you have not heard about it before, it's very I think it's very important. It's sort of our way of moving into a kind of advocacy role here of sort of pressuring governments to kind of report their military emissions. Not many countries do. In fact, almost none do it correctly. And so we're sort of behind all this research and this work is to sort of bring um, sort of illuminate on the fact that we really are a starting point here of zero when we think about the ways in which we need to move forward in terms of understanding militaries as global climate actors. Sort of pointing the finger on their role as being sort of contributing significantly to fossil fuel consumption, hydrocarbons, but a whole host of other ways in which they need to now sort of report and then all make meaningful cuts to their greenhouse gas emissions. I think I'll stop there.